is Professor Naomi Roth-Ariaza, who UC's Hastings College of the Law in San Francisco, who, in a repeat performance of her marvelous lecture of last year, will introduce us to the legal aftermath of the Holocaust, namely the Nuremberg war crimes trials and the moral and legal concepts on which they were based. And she will also update us on the status of the International War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague that is currently dealing with accused war criminals from the Yugoslavian Civil War. Professor Ariaza teaches international human rights as well as environmental law at Hastings College. She received her BA and Master's in Public Policy and Law in Public Policy and her law degree from UC Berkeley. She was the first Riesenfeld Fellow in International Law at the UC Berkeley Law School, and last year she received a Fulbright Senior Scholarship for Research in Europe. Perhaps you can tell us more about what that was about. She is the author of the book Impunity and Human Rights in International Law and Practice, published last year by Oxford University Press, and of several articles on issues of accountability for human rights violations. She serves on the Board of Human Rights Advocates, a San Francisco-based group. Naomi, welcome back to the Holocaust Lecture Series.
Thank you. Hello? Yes? Yes, okay. All right, well, I was asked to come speak today about preventing genocide, and so I'd like to start from there. When we think of preventing, usually we think of doing things before the fact, of stopping something from happening before it does. And there are, of course, a number of ways to do that I won't talk about, but let me just give you a couple of ideas. Early warning systems, getting in the middle of potential conflicts to help them stop from escalating, teaching tolerance, protecting the rights of minorities. There's a whole slew of actions that we could talk about, the object of which would be to stop genocides before they happen. Law has a place in these, but what I want to talk about is the place of law in strategies for preventing genocide that focus after the fact of a genocide happening. And I'd like to talk specifically about war crimes investigations and war crimes trials and tribunals, and talk about whether and how they can be helpful in stopping future genocides, because I think that is the issue, that one of the reasons we develop strategies around war crimes prosecutions and war crimes tribunals is because of some sense that not only are there reasons after the fact for prosecuting people, but that by doing so, we may have an effect on preventing future genocides. And so that's what I want to talk about. So what I'm going to do is start with some historical background and some ideas on what roles exactly war crimes tribunals can play, what roles they have played in the past, and then talk about current efforts in Bosnia and Rwanda, and then leave you with some thoughts on where we may be going in the future. Now, the modern history here can be divided into three phases. The sort of post-World War II tribunals and war crimes trials, then another second phase until the end of the Cold War, and then finally the phase. Now, to begin, I want to talk about the post-World War II war crimes trials and tribunals. And I'm going to focus on Nuremberg, although it is important to recognize that there were two international tribunals in the wake of World War II. The Far East Tribunal, also known as the Tokyo Tribunal, who tried people who were responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Far East, and the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. In addition to that, it's important to note that the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg tried a small number of defendants whose crimes had no single geographic location, and so they couldn't really be tried by any single country because their crimes spanned a range of countries. And so the only institution that seemed to have adequate jurisdiction over them was the international community as a whole. In addition to that, it is important to recognize that in the wake of World War II, there were a much larger number of defendants tried by Allied courts in the different sectors that were set up of Germany after World War II, and a still larger number that were tried by German courts. So when we talk about war crimes and war crimes tribunals, it's important to keep in mind the full range from the international down to the role of national courts. Now, why was Nuremberg important? What was it that we were trying to do there? Well, I would posit that there were a number of things. First, the creation of a historical record. The idea, and Justice Jackson said this very clearly, was you had to establish incredible events by credence. One of the purposes for doing this in a trial is that a trial, through the mechanisms of cross-examination, of having to bring forward evidence, of having two versions of reality confront each other, allows us in a way to get at a historical record that may more easily be considered authoritative, that may withstand what back in the 1940s was very clear to come, which were the denials, the revisions, the idea that this couldn't possibly really have happened. And so the idea was that by bringing the evidence forward through a trial, it would be more difficult for those who came later and tried to deny the existence of the Holocaust or to come up with revisionist views of what had happened to make their case, because the evidence would actually be there in front of everyone for people to see. Second, the idea was to establish the rule of law. In this case, to make very clear the difference with the Nazis. Whereas it was said, if the Germans had won the war, they would have gone out and summarily shot everyone on the other side. The Allies were very interested in showing that this was not going to be their method, that they were going to provide an adequate defense, that they were going to hold people responsible, but in a way that privileged the rule of law, and therefore hopefully set up conditions not only to mark the differences between the Allies and their opponents, but to set the stage so that in the future the rule of law would be more securely established throughout Europe. Thirdly, the trials were to establish that international crimes could be committed by individuals and punished as such. In other words, that it wasn't just a question of the responsibility of the states involved. It wasn't just a government issue. Governments were not abstractions. Governments were made up of individuals, and those individuals could be held accountable internationally as such. This was a very important idea to once and for all in international law. Mostly the idea was that this was going to serve as a deterrent, both to those same people, in other words, the hierarchy of the German government and the Nazi Party, and more generally to people who might be contemplating similar sorts of adventures in the future. That if you could establish that the response of the international community was going to be to hold you personally and individually responsible for the results of your actions, and to hold you penally responsible, to throw you in jail or to hang you, that this would have a deterrent effect for the future. And then the fourth reason was the idea of channeling vengeance, that it was necessary to take people's understandable and widely shared revulsion and anger over what the Nazis had done and channel that into a sort of socially sanctioned process, rather than having, as did happen throughout Europe, revenge killings, summary executions of people who were considered to be collaborators and the like. The idea was that to the extent you could use the legal system to process these claims in a way that they would not be, people would not take the law into their own hands, and that this was important to stop the possibility of a cycle of vengeance and then counter-vengeance and then counter-vengeance from one side or the other. And I think these ideas are very important as we go forward because they are the ideas that underlay not only Nuremberg, but the current efforts to bring war criminals and those who've committed genocide and crimes against humanity to justice. All right. Now, let me go on and talk about what were the crimes that were tried at Nuremberg. There were three categories of crimes. First, crimes against peace. The definition of this was waging an aggressive war. The German military and political leadership was tried for having waged aggressive war. In the years since Nuremberg, this has been perhaps the least developed branch of the law, in part because as the Nuremberg trials ended, the Cold War began, and the definition of who was the aggressor became caught up in Cold War politics. And so it was impossible to come to a universally agreed upon definition as to what constituted aggressive war within the context of the Cold War. You tended to get long debates at the UN down through the years that kind of looked like that. Both sides pointing the finger at each other and saying, well, you did this, but you did that, but you did this. And so I'm not going to talk very much more about aggressive war and crimes against peace. I will talk quite a bit about war crimes, which is the second category of crime. Now, this was not the first time that there had been problems for war crimes. Existing rules going back to the 14th century, at the very least, prohibited the killing of prisoners of war, the killing of the wounded, the wanton killing of civilians in enemy territory, and things like that. Very first prosecution for war crimes was in the 14th century when Peter von Hagesberg was hanged for raping, pillaging, and murdering civilians of his duke in one of the many wars in feudal Europe. So this was not by any means a new idea. However, there were a number of places where the Nuremberg jurisprudence on war crimes did represent a significant advance. One of those, which I'll touch on briefly, is the idea of superior orders. The Nuremberg tribunals established definitively, not for the first time, that superior orders are no defense where a moral choice is possible. Now, this was important because within military structures, of course, soldiers are not free to do what they like. They take orders, and military structures don't work if soldiers don't take orders. And so, of course, what started happening as people were brought up as defendants before war crimes tribunals is that each of them would say, I'm not responsible because I was just following the orders of my superior. And you'd go to the superior, and the superior would say, well, me too. And you'd go up the line, and every single person would say, well, me too, until you got up to Hitler, who was the one person who couldn't be tried because he was dead. And so it was very problematic. If you allowed a defense of superior orders, pretty much the whole structure of prosecution crumbled. So what was established was that as long as the soldiers have a moral choice, and there's been more and more research coming out in recent years that soldiers in at least that situation did actually have a moral choice. Those who disobeyed orders, at the very most, were reassigned, but they were not thrown in jail. They were not killed. If you have a moral choice, and the order that you're given is manifestly illegal, as most of these orders were, superior orders is not a defense. Although recognizing the counter-argument, which is, I'm a soldier, I must do what I'm told, superior orders can be used in mitigation of punishment. In other words, rather than hanging you, we'll throw you in jail for a term of years because we do understand that there was some degree of lack of free will or of coercion or of following orders involved here. The Tokyo Tribunal on the war crimes issue came up with another rule which is very useful, especially in the context of former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And that was the idea of command responsibility, which is kind of the flip side of the idea of superior orders. And that's the idea that if you are a superior officer, things that go on under your command that you either know about and do nothing about or should know about and do nothing about are your personal responsibility. So that you can't, as was often the case, the defense that, well, I didn't know it was happening. I didn't know that the people under my command were doing this. And that has been very important, especially in the charges in the former Yugoslavia. Much of the law on war crimes was subsequently codified in the 1949 Geneva Conventions. There are 4 of them, and they pretty much set out widely accepted now to be the customary law of defining war crimes. Now, the third crime at Nuremberg was crimes against humanity. Now, the reason crimes against humanity was problematic was because up until that time, there was no clearly established category of crime that could take into account crimes committed by a government against its own people. Notice that war crimes requires, or at least at the time, required an international conflict and had to do with what you did to the civilians on the other side. Well, that was all very well and good, but it didn't deal with what the Germans did to German Jews, right? And there was no way you could get at that through war crimes. So this other category of crimes against humanity was intended to deal with that situation. Humanity is defined in the Charter of the International Military Tribunal as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds in execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal, whether or not in violation of the domestic law. In other words, if it was legal under jurisdiction, it doesn't matter. That's what that last little bit is about. Right? How are crimes against humanity different from plain old garden variety murder, extermination, enslavement, rape, etc.? One is numerosity. We're talking about crimes against lots of people. Therefore, the use of the word populations. Yeah. 2, there has to be some sort of plan. There has to be some intent. It doesn't have to be an intent specifically to get rid of everybody, but it has to be part of a larger plan. It can't be random, right? Now, crimes against humanity were created to deal with crimes that had never before been seen on that scale. The attempted extermination of a people simply because of their existence as such had been seen very few times before. Arguably, the Armenian genocide is the one precursor of this. But it raised a series of legal moral problems. And the main one was, if this was something that had never before been codified into law, how could you hold people criminally responsible for something that wasn't a crime when they did it? This is the ex post facto problem, right? One of the bedrocks of the criminal law is that you can only hold people liable for crimes that were crimes when they committed them. You can't, after the fact, go around making up crimes. And the reason is that people need to be on notice as to what's legal behavior and what's illegal behavior, right? Now, what was the solution that was found to this dilemma? Well, and here was rather easy. They went back and they said, look, if the reason for having an ex post facto prohibition, which, by the way, is in our law as well as in international law, the reason for this is because we want to put people on notice as to what's legal behavior and what's illegal behavior. Well, we don't think there's much of a notice problem in saying that the massive and planned extermination of a people is something that is, by any intuitive, commonsensical, plain old ordinary sense of the word, against the law. You can't go out and murder thousands of people. Right? This is not an issue of notice. Yeah? This is not something where people are going, oh, well, I didn't know that. Not likely to happen. Therefore, it was said, there is no ex post facto prohibition. There has always been a prohibition in the customary law of nations against doing this sort of thing. All we are is now codifying that into the written law. This is, as you might imagine, has remained somewhat controversial in terms of a legal method. Nonetheless, it is now pretty universally accepted that crimes against humanity are crimes in customary international law and may be punished as such. So those were the three crimes that were at issue at Nuremberg. Of Nuremberg, in 1948, the Genocide Convention was drafted. It took the U.S. 40 years to ratify it, but we have now ratified the Genocide Convention. And what that did was attempt, in a sense, to codify what I've just been talking about. The Genocide Convention prohibits the destruction in whole or in part of a religious, national, or ethnic group. There are, however, and there are a series of clauses which tell you exactly what that means, and there are a number of other pieces to it which I won't go into, but there are a couple of problems with it which have meant that it hasn't been used nearly as much as I think the drafters thought it was going to be used. One is that it requires a showing of intent. You have to show that you intend to destroy the racial, ethnic, religious, or national, in whole or in part. Now, that is sometimes a hard showing to make. And in the criminal law, of course, with presumptions of innocence, we make the prosecutor go show every element of the crime, right? So when it comes time for the prosecutor to have to show that someone had a specific intent, that has often been difficult to do. The defendant says, I didn't know it would happen. Take the case, for instance, Russian famines in the Ukraine as a result of collectivization. Was that genocide? Unclear. 30 million people died. Well, but can you show that the relevant Soviet authorities had a specific intent to destroy any racial, ethnic, religious, or national group? Not clear. Another example, Cambodia. Several million people died. Can you show that the Pol Pot regime had a specific intent to destroy a specific racial, ethnic, national, or religious group? No. It's been one of the difficulties in the Cambodian case. Together with that is the other problem with the Genocide Convention. That is, it doesn't cover political opponents. And there's a big fight about this. The reason it doesn't cover political opponents is because both the U.S. and the Soviet Union at the time were opposed to it, because they both thought that if it covered political opponents, they might both someday be brought up on charges of genocide for one reason or another. And so for that reason, the language of the Genocide Convention does not cover political opponents, which again limits its usefulness, because a lot of the genocides that we have seen in the post-Nuremberg era have been based on perceived or actual political opponents. And so these then don't come within the strictures of the Genocide Convention. All right. One final point about Nuremberg. Despite all the advances of the Nuremberg prosecutions, there was one problem that the Nuremberg prosecutions were never able quite to evade, and that is the accusation that this was victor's justice. That if the Germans had won the war, it would be the U.S. and the Brits and the French sitting in the dock for the bombing of Dresden, for dropping the bomb on Hiroshima, for a number of things not taken into account in the tribunals. And although there have been answers to this, the prosecutions have never completely escaped the shadow of that accusation, that this was simply a politically motivated justice of the victors. That was certainly how it was seen in many parts of Germany for a while. So when we come up to the present day and we start thinking about, well, now what do we want to do? One of the things that the international community has been very careful in thinking about has been, how do we avoid having that accusation dog what we're doing now? So let me leave you with that. I'll come back to it in a couple of minutes. Now, the Genocide Convention was to have been complemented by an international criminal court. With the Cold War, that became impossible. So the attention then shifted to national courts. And I want to skip ahead and very quickly mention a couple of the possibilities of national courts, because I want to move on and talk about what's going on now. During the 1980s, there were a number of countries that went from being military dictatorships, more or less, to being more or less electoral democracies. And they all had to deal with the issue of what to do with the people who had been responsible for mass rights violations during the period of military rule. And I won't go through all the cases specifically, and maybe you can ask if you're interested in questions, but there were trials in Greece, there were trials in Argentina, in Bolivia, there were a number of other measures taken in Chile, in El Salvador, in South Africa, in the Philippines, in Eastern Europe, a wide range of countries, Ethiopia, I'll keep thinking of them, but there were a bunch. There were several lessons that came out of this series of national attempts to deal with the aftermath of genocide, or sometimes not of genocide, but of massive human rights violations. First was the idea of separating the role of truth from the role of justice. Remember when I started, we talked about how one of the reasons why you had trials was to get at the truth. Well, in a number of countries, it was impossible to have trials, either because the military had given itself an amnesty and the civilian government didn't have the power to overturn that amnesty without getting itself overturned, or for a number of other reasons. And so human rights advocates came up with the idea that, well, if you can't have trials, at the very least, there should be some process for getting at the truth of what. And so you get things like truth commissions, investigative missions to look at what the prior government did, and a whole series of efforts to get at truth, even if not at justice. Second was the idea of the focus on redress for victims. The criminal law doesn't focus much on victims. The criminal law focuses on perpetrators. And both in this country and internationally, through the years, there has been an understanding that, well, it's important to look at what these processes do to victims. What does it do to the people who were first harmed by what was done to them, and then maybe harmed by being excluded, ignored, or worse, during the subsequent process of coming to terms with what happened. And so there was an increasing effort to look at, number one holding trials was to provide some redress for the people who had been hurt. And number two, the way we designed those trials and those procedures had to reflect some understanding of what the victims wanted, needed, were asking for. The third issue, which I'll just touch on briefly, was what about amnesty? And I'll come back to this in the context of the Yugoslav conflict. What about the idea that bygones have to be bygones, that the only way a society is going to be able to put itself back together after a conflict like this is by both sides forgiving each other and agreeing to move on? And that was a big, and still is, a big topic of debate throughout the 1980s and early 1990s. With the end of the Cold War, a new phase began, and I'm going to move about that. The event that I think triggered this new phase was the breakout of war in the territory of the former Yugoslavia. For the first time, there were news stories of gaunt prisoners behind barbed wire in Eastern Europe. And this was the first time since the Nazis that such a thing had been. The news media were on the ground fairly early, bringing back these images that looked very reminiscent of the images to which people had said never again. And yet here we were, not 50 years later, and never again was happening. And so this brought up a series of attempts to do something. The other thing was, of course, the end of the Cold War, which made it possible to actually do something, because this was no longer seen within the East context of East-West conflict. So what happened? Well, the first thing that happened was a commission of inquiry, a commission of notables that went to the former Yugoslavia and combined with existing human rights mechanisms, looked at what was happening on the ground, came back and said, yes, what is going on there can be class genocide. This is not just a question of moving people around. What is going on here could be considered genocidal. At that point, there was a lot of pressure on the United States and on the United Nations to act. And so you get the creation of the Ad Hoc Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia. There are several lists to this. First innovation is, how is this tribunal set up? Rather than a treaty among all the nations involved, or the nations of the UN, or, as was the case in the International Military Tribunal, through a charter signed by the Allied powers who were occupying Germany, the way this tribunal, and also the subsequent Rwanda tribunal, has been set up has been through Chapter 7 under the auspices of the Security Council. Let me explain what I mean by that. The UN Charter contains provisions that allow the Security Council to respond to threats to the peace and security of the world. The Security Council must make a finding that there is a threat to international peace and security, and then they can do pretty much anything and everything, up to and including armed intervention, to respond to international peace and security. And it was under these provisions of the UN Charter, which all states who are UN members have agreed to, right, that the UN Ad Hoc Tribunal was set up. Now, this had several advantages. First of all, unlike a treaty, you didn't have to go around and specifically get not only every government's executive branch, but in many cases every government's legislative branch to agree to this, which who were drafting this process thought would have taken much too long. Second was, states which did not cooperate with the tribunal could have sanctions imposed on them by the UN Security Council, which were then mandatory for all members of the United Nations. And so it was thought that by doing this under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, there would be somewhat more of a involved in it, in that countries who for instance, wanted to keep receiving UN development assistance, or countries that didn't want to be ostracized completely from the UN, would find it very difficult to, over a period of time, fail to surrender people who were wanted by the Ad Hoc Tribunal. The downside to this, of course, is that, as several states pointed out, nowhere in the UN Charter say that the Security Council can establish organs that will establish individual criminal liability, individual criminal responsibility. The Genocide Convention provides for an international criminal court, but nowhere in the Charter does it say the Security Council can do this. Answer: nowhere in the Charter does it say the Security Council can't. And so that was sort of the way the debate was framed. And in the end, this was established, as I say, under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. It's interesting to read the resolutions creating the tribunals, because they go into why it is that ethnic cleansing and detention camps and killings and landmines and the rest of what we've seen in the former Yugoslavia, although it's taking place within an area that's fairly well defined, I mean, nobody has been going into France with this, is still a threat to the international peace and security. And why a tribunal is thought of as being a way to deal with this. And what they talk about are some of the things that I mentioned at the beginning: deterrence, establishing the rule of international law, avoiding the spillover effects of this conflict on the rest of Europe in terms of refugees and the like, but very much an emphasis on the deterrence aspect, that if we are interested in preventing future genocides, we need not to let this one go by. If we let this one go by, the lesson that will be the lesson that will go out to the world is, we didn't mean it. So that's what's very, very clearly within the Security Council resolution, and also the Secretary General's report setting up the tribunal. All right, how does it work? One other point on this: because the tribunal is established by the Security Council can disband it. And one of the issues, of course, is under what conditions will the Security Council choose to disband the tribunal? which I'll raise a little bit later. All right, so the tribunal was established in 1993. This is the tribunal in the former Yugoslavia. It's made up of 3 branches, a registry, a prosecutor's office, and a court with 11 judges. The 11 judges are drawn from all over the world. What are the crimes covered? Genocide, as we talked about. War crimes, both under an earlier convention called the Hague Convention, which talks about things like bombing of civilians, planting of landmines, destruction of cultural property, and the like. Crimes against humanity, as I've discussed it. And those are basically it. And war crimes under the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which I've also talked about some. Interestingly, the Secretary General's report setting up the tribunal says that these are now rules that are established in customary international law. What that means is that even if you as a state have never signed a treaty saying you won't commit genocide, you're still bound under international law not to commit genocide. Even if you've never signed a treaty saying that you won't commit war crimes, you're still bound not to commit war crimes. That's what it means that something is part of customary international law. It doesn't have to be a treaty in the way. Okay? Now, what has happened so far? Well, I'm not going to go through the stuff that y'all can read in the newspapers. There are 53 people under indictment in the former Yugoslavia. There are 10 people under indictment in Rwanda. The Rwandan statute is slightly different in that there was no question as to whether it was an international or a national armed conflict. One of the issues in the former Yugoslavian case is, are these separate countries so that this is a conflict between Serbia versus Bosnia-Herzegovina versus Croatia? Or is this an internal conflict between the Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats, and Bosnian Muslims? Yeah? The statute setting up the tribunal ducks the issue. It says it doesn't matter. Right? Either way, you don't need to decide that. Either way, the rules of war are the same. Either way, the prohibition on genocide is the same. We don't need to say whether this is a national or an international armed conflict, because the kinds of things for which people are being indicted are crimes whether or not this is an international conflict. Just a little bit of background on that. One of the differences in the rules of war are that the rules covering international conflicts are far stronger than the rules covering domestic civil wars. For obvious reasons, when you have governments making the rules, governments would be much happier having strong rules when their army is fighting somebody else's army and not when their army is fighting what they will variously describe as terrorists, secessionists, anarchists, agitators, or any number of other things, right? So the rules that you get on internal or civil wars tend to be much weaker. The tribunals respond, we don't care. We don't need to get into this. No matter what you call it, the things that we're talking about are prohibited, okay? Now, in the Rwandan case, you don't have any allegation that there's an international conflict. It was very clearly a civil conflict. So the statute of the tribunal there covers genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes under Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which is the article that applies to war, basically. Let me talk a little bit about some of the problems and some of the issues that have come up with the tribunals. First of all, the most obvious question, they've got 53 individuals indicted on the former Yugoslavia, of whom I think they're now up to 5 are in custody as of today. But in any case, the vast majority of them are not in custody, and unless there is a significant change in the political climate, some of them are not likely to be in custody anytime soon. Especially notable in that regard are the indictments against Karadzic and Mladic, who are the 2 Bosnian Serb leaders who have apparently been seen skiing within sight of NATO troops who have declined to arrest them, saying, you know, we're not a police force. We're out to go out and arrest suspects. Now, of course, if they walk into our office and say hello, we might maybe arrest them, but we're not going to go out and actively search. So one question that this raises is, what is the point of these tribunals if, at least for many of the defendants, they're never going to show up in court? Now, let me preface that by saying, unlike Nuremberg, there is no for trial in absentia under the tribunals. And this was done on purpose. The idea was that there was something a little bit, I don't know how to call it, less than legitimate about trying people in absentia. That if one of the purposes of this thing was to uphold the rule of law and show that we were different, and that, unlike the butchers who were the defendants, we were people who were cognizant of all requirements of due process and the like, that it wouldn't do to go around trying people and condemning them to death or to long periods of jail in absentia. So there is no provisions. You can't do that. Well, okay, so what do? Well, what they came up with is a rather innovative procedure called the public indictment procedure, also known as a Rule 61 procedure. You may also see that term. What it means is that if the defendant cannot be pulled into custody, the prosecutor can basically make up a dossier with all the evidence against these people, can bring it to a chamber of the court, present the evidence, if the chamber of the court agrees that there's enough to go forward with, they can then go before the full court, the full chamber. It has to be presented to one judge first, and then to the full chamber. And there can be a public presentations. The idea is that basically the prosecution puts on its case without the defendant being there. But it's not called a trial in absentia because there's no judgment at the end of it. At the end of it, what you get is an international arrest warrant. The international arrest warrant is then sent out through Interpol and all of these international police services. And if the person is found anywhere in any country which belongs to the UN, that country is under an obligation then to turn them over to the tribunal for trial. Now, what is the point of doing this? Well, a couple of things. One, go back to what I said a couple of minutes ago about the importance of truth, the importance of historical record, the importance of getting the facts out there. The idea is that even if the defendant isn't there, at least we want everybody to know what this person is accused of doing. So you have to be able to come and tell their story. You have evidence from the exhumations of mass graves being presented with DNA evidence that these people were killed in a certain way. You have eyewitnesses coming from the villages around where this happened talking about who they knew was in charge. You have what is basically a mini trial, a sort of prosecution's version. And this allows the facts to be aired. It allows witnesses to come forward and tell the story. It allows negative publicity about the defendant. The idea is that the defendant doesn't like this. They're perfectly free to come forward and contest it, right? So this is not a violation of due process because any defendant wants to show up and bring their own evidence. Hey, they're willing to listen, right? No problem, yeah? If they choose not to, right, then there is this ability to allow the evidence to be put forward. Second point, in practice, what has happened, at least in the former Yugoslavia, is that many of the people who have been indicted by the tribunal are either in the Bosnian Serb-held territory or in Serbia. And barring a last-minute change of mind by President Milosevic, probably quite a few of them will not be turned over to the tribunal. It's also questionable whether or not Milosevic can get some of them to be turned over to the tribunal, even if he wants to. But for people in positions of military and political power, it is not a good place to be, to not be able to leave the Bosnian Serb-held territory, because if you do, you will be arrested and tried. It is very hard to be the leader of a state, to go to diplomatic conferences, to negotiate treaties, to negotiate economic aid, to participate in international, for all the things that political leaders of countries do. If you know that the minute you step outside the territory where you are, in a sense, holed up, you're going to be arrested and dragged off for trial. It's very hard to see, for instance, how a Karadzic could participate as the leader of any sort of Bosnian Serb anything if he can't go to Geneva, and he can't go to New York, and he can't go to London, and he can't go anywhere. Because if he does, he's going to get arrested. And so the idea was that, well, even if we can't put these guys in jail, to the extent we're getting at the political leaders, we can basically disable them politically so that they cannot play any significant role as leaders of their country. Now, of course, that's all very well for the Karadzics of the world. It doesn't do very much for the foot soldiers, who really don't care one way or the other. But at least as far as those people are concerned, that's the idea of the Article 61 procedure. There have been a number of other difficulties, which I want to speak about briefly. One is extradition. Even for people who are in custody in other places, and there are some amazing stories. The first defendant to come to trial is a guy named Tadic, who was the commander of one of the concentration camps in Bosnia. And he was found as he eventually fled to Germany. And as he was walking down the street in a city in Germany, some people who had been prisoner in the Amarska camp saw him and sort of ran after him and, sort of found other people, and they followed him home, and then they went and found other people, and they all corroborated among themselves, yeah, that's the guy. And they then went and called the German government, who promptly arrested the guy. So there are some incredible stories as to how these defendants have come before. The problem in the Tadic case was it turned out that Germany didn't have any extradition treaty with the tribunal that would allow them to turn this guy over to an international tribunal. Now, that's not surprising. Nobody has an extradition treaty with an international tribunal because there hasn't been one, right? So there's been no reason to do that. And so one of the problems that you've had is that even once a government has one of these guys in custody, they then have to go through a long, somewhat fairly involved process of creating domestic law that will allow them to transfer the person to the tribunal. This has been particularly problematic in the Rwandan case, where a lot of the defendants are scattered throughout other African countries, none of whom have extradition treaties with anyone. Not with Rwanda and not with the tribunal. And there has been a considerable amount of reluctance on the part of some of these countries to enter into such extradition treaties. Has been a big stumbling block in actually getting people within the custody of the tribunal, especially notable Cameroon, Togo, a number of other Western African countries where there are people who've been indicted by the War Crimes Tribunal for Rwanda, who we know are in custody there, but they're not going anywhere because there's no extradition treaty. There are also big proof problems. It's suspected in the former Yugoslavia because up until recently there was no security for going into any of the areas where there were mass graves in order to get at the forensic evidence which has to serve as the basis for the prosecutor's proof in a lot of these cases. I mean, it's not something you can just sort of waltz into, territory that's held by, that's under the control of Bosnian Serbs when you are interested in indicting people from Serbs. That are not likely to give you a free hand to do that, and so it's been rather difficult to get at the necessary kinds of proof. Another issue, especially in both cases, but it's been most prominent in the former Yugoslav case, is this question of, is this another repeat of Nuremberg? Is this the justice of the victors? And as you can see if you've watched the news recently, there's been a very concerted effort to avoid any appearance that one group or another has been singled out. And so there are indictments primarily against Bosnian Serbs, but also against several Bosnian Croats, including several generals, and also against Bosnian Muslims. There are far more indictments of Serbs. There's far more evidence there. But the tribunal has said repeatedly that it is willing and able to indict anyone against whom there is evidence, independent of which side they were on. Similarly, in the Rwandan context, the immense majority of victims of the Rwandan genocide were Tutsi. The immense majority of perpetrators were Hutu. There is a very serious question if all the indictments that the tribunal brings down are all of Hutu for the killing of Tutsi, when it is known that there quite a bit of killing of Hutu by Hutu. And so there has been quite a bit of effort put into bringing indictments not only on genocide counts, but also on counts of crimes against humanity, where the victims were so-called moderate Hutu, were people who opposed the government that was doing the genocide, but were of the same ethnic group. Another big problem in the tribunals has been money. The tribunals have been on 3 months. I don't know if anybody has ever tried to work where you don't know where your money is coming from after 3 months, but it really does put a crimp in having professional investigations underway. Very, very difficult to get people to take on long-term commitments when you don't know if you can pay them more than 3 months in advance. Their resources have been entirely inadequate for what they've been asked to do. They do these very complicated criminal investigations which have to be done right, because if they're done wrong, the whole thing falls apart. And yet they have not had the resources to do that. I have to say that the U.S. government has actually been quite good in seconding people to the staff of the tribunals in order to cut down their costs. However, they have been less good in sort of money aspects, in part because of wrangles with the Congress over overall funding for the UN, which we can talk about if you want. But it has made a big difference. All right, let me say one more thing about this. The tribunals, the ad hoc tribunals on the former Yugoslavia and on Rwanda will necessarily only indict and only try a very small percentage of the cases. They can't do anything else. They have to focus on the top-level people, as many of them as they can get. They're not going to be able to focus on everyone. Just to give you the example of the Rwandan case, in Rwanda you had anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million people killed in a 3-month period with no high-tech weapons. Those people who calculate such things, that means that at least 100,000 people were actively involved in murder. Now, the United States would have a very, very hard time trying 100,000 people on anything. Right? Now imagine a country like Rwanda. Yeah? And you can see where some of the difficulties come up. Now, what does that mean? Well, a couple of things. First of all, the international tribunals are focusing on the high-level people, the people who ran the con camps, the people who ordered the massacres, the people who designed the plans, the people who set in motion. Yeah, they're not focusing, although they do have a couple in the Yugoslav case, but they're not focusing on the low-level folks. Now, there are national plans to have national trials in both Bosnia and in Rwanda to deal with all the cases that the International Tribunal will never get to. Now, there are an incredible number of problems with these national prosecutions. In the Bosnian case, there were a couple of prosecutions. I don't know if people remember, a couple of years ago, there were a couple of guys who were convicted on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. They came up with confessions. There was a lot in the international community as to whether the confessions were coerced, as to whether this trial actually was in conformance with standards of international due process. There are a lot of questions of that kind in both Rwanda and in the former Yugoslavia. And people are working with the legal systems in both those countries to try to assure that whatever is done with both the appearance and the reality of fundamental fairness, because there won't be any point. Let me talk a little bit about the Rwandan case, both because it's the one I know most about and because it's the one that I think you probably know least about. As I said, in Rwanda, you have about 100,000 people who may have participated in genocide. People in Rwanda who were killed with machetes, with farm implements, with hoes, with knives. This was all very low-tech stuff. There are 67,000 people in jail in Rwanda as I speak, accused of genocide. Jail conditions are abominable. Somebody told me it looks like the IRT subway in New York at rush hour. There is no room to sit down, much less lie down. in the jails. People are being fed adequately only because the International Red Cross has taken charge of their feeding. The Rwandan government is quite conscious of the fact that they do something about this, that this is not an acceptable state of affairs. But they are a government that took power in 1994 in the wake of the most complete devastation the country has ever seen. There was not much of a legal system there to begin with. What little there was completely torn apart by this whole thing. A lot of people were killed. A lot of people left the country as refugees. There are maybe anywhere between 300. The most optimistic estimate says there's 800 lawyers in the country. I don't believe it. I think it's closer to 300. There are very, very few judges. It's an extraordinarily poor country. And while there has been a significant amount of aid going to the refugees outside Rwanda, there has been very little aid going inside the country to try to rebuild the justice system. There are plans to begin trials within Rwanda. I'm still not sure how much I believe that they're going to start anytime soon. The idea that they came up with is that, look, they can't try 67,000 people. Everybody knows that, right? We couldn't try 67,000 people. There's no way they're going to be able to do it. The top level of people will be, to the extent this is possible, indicted and tried by the tribunal. Most of them, in fact, all of those people are now residing outside Rwanda. They all fled. And so it's the tribunal's job to track them down, indict them, and try them, right? That leaves everybody who is the sort of middle level and bottom level, and some of the people who were fairly high up in the national government but who they managed to catch before they could leave. And those are the people that the Rwandan government is talking about trying. What they have said is that they will distinguish those who were organizers, planners, or people otherwise high up in the hierarchy who were responsible for putting in motion this plan of genocide, and that those people will be tried on charges of murder, rape, pillage, or whatever else the sort of common law crimes are. And if found guilty, the death penalty does apply in Rwanda. By the way, one of the sources of tension in Rwanda has been that the death penalty does not apply in the tribunal. There is no death penalty. And so the Rwandans, with some degree of sense, say, look, for all these middle and low level guys, if we find them guilty, we're going to hang them. But the top level people, if they find them guilty, they're going to go sit in a Dutch jail somewhere, right? What kind of justice is that? The answer the tribunal is given is, look, it is the consensus of the international community that the death penalty is archaic, and we are not going to impose it. We will make sure that the life in the Dutch jail is not as cushy as you might think. It is still a point that somewhat rankles when you talk to the Rwandans. They're a little upset about this. Then they say for the mid and low level people, they will have some combination of plea bargaining and the ability to come forward with a confession and tell sort of what happened, who was in charge, who organized all of this, in exchange for which there will be a vastly reduced sentence. Unclear what that means. The latest proposal that I saw from the Rwandan Congress was a reduced sentence with 15 years in jail. I'm not sure that's going to work with 67,000 people, but that's what they're talking about. In any case, some kind of plea bargaining / confession situation which will avoid trial for at least most of these people because they are fully cognizant that they cannot have trials. All right. Let me end by doing two things. First, let me talk about the prospects for an international criminal court. The end of the Cold War means that it is again possible to talk about an international criminal court. And there are drafts out there. A group called the International Law Commission, which is a sort of UN group of experts, came up with a draft 2 years ago now, both as to what a court would look like and what the criminal code that it would apply would look like. Because one of the problems is if you have an international criminal court, what law does it apply? Well, you have two possibilities. One is it applies the domestic law of wherever the perpetrator is from, and the other is that it has its own body of law. whether it be or domestic. Now, international law is a very good thing, but international law is, or at least has in general, been directed towards states. And in order for it to be directly applicable to international criminal defendants, you need to do a lot of filling in the blanks. There's a lot of gaps in there. It's a very general kind of law. And, you know, if you'd get a sort of local court in California to take a look at some of these things, they'd say, no way, this is much too vague. It needs to be spelled out much more in order for it to be applicable to criminal procedure. To criminal proceeding, I'm sorry. So one thing that's been worked on is a code that, it's called the Draft Code of Draft Code of Offenses Against the Peace and Security of Mankind, which I hope will become persons fairly soon. But so far it's still mankind. That details some of the things I've been talking about as the basis that a court could apply. The other possibility, which is the current draft, is to say we don't need to wait on agreeing everybody on a criminal code, because that might take a while. We can get this court together, have it apply the national law of the defendant. That way there's no issue of due process, because if the defendant were tried in a national court, that's the law that would apply. So they know that law. They know how it works, presumably. There's not these same kind of notice issues that I talked about before. And we can move forward that way. And so that's the proposal now before the UN. There is an ad hoc committee of states working on a draft. They will hopefully, there will be a call to a drafting conference by the end of this year. And hopefully by 1998 there will be a treaty which states can sign, which will then commit them to supporting an international criminal court. That would be a big step forward, because it would avoid this problem of ad hoc tribunals. It would get us out of the problem of victor's justice, because this would be an institution that could be called on, that would have judges of many different states, that would try defendants of many different states. There are a whole lot of problems with it in terms of its jurisdiction. How do you get jurisdiction over defendants, and a whole bunch of other technical stuff which we can do like. But it would clearly be a step forward. I was asked, well, given all of this, what can ordinary people do in this area? And I mean, this is a sort of a harder area to answer that question than some others that you may have heard through this series. One thing is, I think this attempt through the ad hoc tribunals is important. I think if it fails, if it goes down in flames, it will be a big setback to efforts to bring to justice people who have committed genocide. And I think that would send exactly the wrong message to future, as the Rwandans call them, génocidaires, future people who are contemplating committing genocide. So I think it's very important to support these tribunals. Let me stress that the support from the U.S. Government is fragile. There is a lot of opposition from the United States Congress to anything that smacks of international anything, and especially anything that smacks of UN anything. And these are, after all, the United Nations ad hoc tribunals. And so to some extent they get caught up in the sort of anti-UN fervor of some of our current legislators, and I would suggest to you that this is a bad thing, and that if you were interested in doing something, is some fruitful work to be done in helping to make sure that our Congress doesn't derail what is trying to be done, however imperfect it may be. Similarly, with an international criminal court, there are a lot of questions as to how this court would work, but in principle, it seems to me that it's a good idea. And there are many people within the United States Congress, especially at this point, who vehemently disagree. And so that might be another fruitful area of activity. A third area is education. I don't think a lot of people know what the tribunals are doing, and I think that's especially true in the Rwandan case. But I think there are sort of periodic newspaper stories, but that don't really give enough of a flavor for what this tribunal has actually been able to do, which, considering its limitations, is actually quite substantial. And so that's another role that you all can play, is to, sort of be the role of educators and ambassadors about this stuff. So let me leave you with a positive thought. It may be that, if this International Criminal Court comes to pass, if the tribunals are successful in bringing to justice at least people most responsible for some of these heinous crimes, for the first time in my lifetime, there may be a way to, at least after the fact, have an impact on deterring genocide. And I think that would be an important statement to be able to saying that the idea of never again is a universal sentiment haven't forgotten. Well, you leave it there, and I'll be happy to take questions. Questions? Yes, and that.
I don't think we should close this session without some sort of a discussion of the pre-Keith trial.
I'm sorry?
I said, I don't think we should leave this session without some discussion of the pre-Keith trial, the SS officer that's going on right now in Italy.
I'm vaguely familiar with this, but not that much. Would you want to say something about it?
Basically, he was in command of a unit that executed 335 Italian people. This was not a Jewish thing. Per se, there were only 75 Jews involved. It was a cross-section of the Italian populace there at the time in Rome. It was a retaliation. It was a standard retaliation of 10 to 1. One man set off a bomb that killed 33 Germans. 330 Italians to be executed in reprisal. Now the hook, the way I see it anyway, discussing your command thing, there was major discussion between the Vatican and Berlin. This guy was in the chute. This guy was in the chute. And Berlin would not back down. That's going to be his defense. It's a war crime, not a genocide. But that's going to be his defense, I'm certain. But he was really in the chute.
There have been a number of national prosecutions of Nazi war criminals. The Barbie case in France, there was one in Canada. They continue to pop up. This one is particularly interesting because it covers both Jews and non-Jews, which has been a sticking point in previous trials. Problem you run into is the statute of limitations. Now, I don't know how the Italian court is going to deal with that. In the French cases, it was very problematic because what they said was crimes against humanity have no statute of limitations, but war crimes do. The idea of a statute of limitations is that eventually the defendant, should be able to go on with their life. The state has a responsibility to bring the case within a reasonable time. Witnesses disappear, they lose their memory, etc. So after a certain time, you cannot bring a criminal prosecution. That's the normal rule. I don't know what it is in Italy, but it's generally 10 years. Some places do not have a statute of limitation for murder. Some places have a 10 or a 20-year statute. I'm not sure what the issue is, what the rule is in Italy. In France, there was a statute of limitations for murder, which had already passed. The issue was if you were to indict, in that case Barbie, or Touvier, there were two of them, for war crimes for having killed resistance leaders, which is what the issue was there, then the statute of limitations would have run, and you wouldn't have been able to do it. And so what the court said was, all right, those crimes are out, but there are crimes against Jews simply because they were Jews. Those are crimes against those have no statute of limitations, and so those can be tried until forever and ever, right, as long as the defendant is alive. So that may very well be an issue here. You may find, for instance, Yes, I know, but the question is whether you can do it under both, because if you can't, you may have a statute of limitations problem. Now, if, as may be the case, the way it comes down is, well, for the 7 who were Jews, right, there is no statute of limitations. Then it raises a whole series of issues about what kind of proof do you have, and can you distinguish? I mean, these are 330 people who were picked at random, basically, right, of whom some were Jewish and some were not. There might be proof problems there, I think. The other issue that comes up when you bring these so far after the fact, and this was brought up in the Yamyuk cases in Israel, is that you have people who are eyewitnesses, but it's 50 years later. And so it's very easy to cross-examine them and to undermine their credibility as witnesses. And that was done repeatedly in Yamyuk and also in the Touvière cases in France, where people would come up and they would say, yes, I recognize him. And then the defense would get up there and say, well, it's 50 years later, here's some pictures, do you recognize this person, that person, the other person, and they'd make a mistake.
That doesn't apply. He admits it. He admits it now, that, he was doing his job.
So all he's saying is superior orders. All he's saying is I was under orders.
Yeah, but way under orders. From Vatican and Berlin, back and forth, and all this is going to come out of it,
Well, the interesting part about that, the sort of truth-telling piece of all of this, right? Even if there is never a conviction in that case, it will bring up very interesting historical testimony about what was the role of the Vatican in all of this, right? What were the connections between the Vatican and the German government? What were the connections between the Vatican and the fascist government, right? I mean, there will be a whole series of very interesting revelations that will come out of this, whether or not there is ever a conviction. And so you may think that it's doing just for that purpose, if for no other.
On the Hague, too.
How? Yeah, I think that's right.
Psychological and maybe legal, but if this guy is not convicted, that one guy just turned himself in today, he's claiming that he had no control over these were irregular troops. Sure, he was a general, but irregular.
That's going to be a very interesting issue, a very interesting legal issue for the tribunal in both Rwanda and Bosnia.
No American general was ever tried for what was happened to Lieutenant Captain.
That's also true. Yes, that may be one of the shames of the United States, yes.
I think the tribunals and the trials, they're wonderful and bring out the facts and we get at the truth. However, don't need much more than that, and I don't know what it is, and I wondered what your ideas are, because we know that the so-called, quote, punishment and trials, they never deterred crimes. They are not, we know from experience, whether it's in private lives or whatever, it never deters or deterred crime. So what else can we do and what else can we have?
Did everybody hear the question? Yes.
Question is what else? Because deterrence doesn't seem to work real well, right? Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not sure deterrence doesn't work real well. I think the question is compared to what? No, it doesn't work perfectly. Yes, crime is still committed. We put people in jail for murder and more people murder people. We put people, we give people traffic tickets and people still speed. I mean, there is this sort of argument in where the law doesn't work, quote, because there's still crime. I'm not sure that's true. I think the relevant comparison is how many people would speed and how many people would kill if there weren't laws against them and if people weren't picked up and given tickets or thrown in jail. And that's, of course, a very hard thing to figure out, right? I mean, how do you find that? You don't. Nonetheless, I think your point is well taken in that I think a punishment-based, it has to be only part of the solution. I don't think we can limit ourselves to saying, well, we put half a dozen bad guys in jail and now the world is right again. We have genocides either currently going on or in the making in a number of places in the world. Burundi, East Timor, I could go on. There are a number of places. What do we do about them? Well, first of all, the ad hoc tribunal will only deal with cases in these two very specific situations of Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. They have a very limited jurisdictional mandate in terms of time and in terms of place. And that was done on purpose. The only way you could get certain countries to agree to go along with this very unorthodox procedure was to say, it won't touch you. Not to worry, right? Indonesia, not to worry, right? You know, we're not going to get at you. So you can't use the ad hoc tribunals to get at any of these other situations. Now, the Burundian case is an interesting one because there, as in Rwanda, there are clear signs of impending disaster, as there were in Rwanda, and we basically ignored them. But there are clear signs that there is increasing ethnic killing, that the army is increasingly less disciplined than if it ever was. It certainly isn't now. That there are Hutu militia who are killing people every day. There are army people who are killing people every day. The tension is palpable. I was in Rwanda in November, and it was very interesting. When you talk to the international people, they said, oh, boy, we'd much rather be in Rwanda than in Burundi. Boy, that place. So you can imagine, you know, what the tension level was like if Rwanda seemed like an oasis of peace next to it. What do we do? Well, there have been continuing efforts on the part of the Secretary General of the UN to put some kind of rapid intervention force on the grounds to separate these people before they kill each other. It has been impossible to do. Nobody came. There was a request for troops sent in to basically be there as kind of monitors and peacekeepers, and their mandate would have been basically to pull people apart and to say and to keep civilians safe. There was a call that went out for troops to all the countries of the United Nations. Not a single one came forward. So, you know, if governments aren't willing to do it, that's not going to happen. Now, there are non-governmental organizations on the ground there doing their best to try and protect civilians, to try and raise the alarm, you know, whenever necessary, to try and do some kind of mediation efforts to try and back the tension level back down. It's very, very difficult to do. We still don't have, and I'm afraid, you know, I don't have the magic bullet. I don't know how to do this. I know we have to get in there and try. It seems to me unconscionable not to try. But I don't know if we know how to do it in these situations. Yeah.
From just what you said, how have they been a preventer? I don't really see them. We've had so much violence since Nuremberg. What, 32 countries in the world in which God knows what's going on, you know, such horrific violence, one-to-one violence is going on. I think it's important that we get in and try and do something, but to say that at this stage it has any kind of preventive, I don't mean to, I don't know if it's naive, but it seemed to be, I mean, Idi Amin was what, 20, 30 years ago. I don't see where it's preventive.
I don't know how much more I can say about it. You know, I think that it's important to have a way to put out facts, and this is probably as good a way as we have that will be authoritative. I think it's important that people see what happened. For me, the sort of the personal experience of hearing testimony about what happened is a very powerful deterrent, is a very powerful way of saying that this cannot happen, that there's got to be a different way out. Now, of course, you know, I'm the convinced people, right? I'm the easy audience, yeah? I mean, the problem is how do you get at the hard audience, yeah? I mean, you know, the things that people talk about are education, starting with kids, you know.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah,
You know,
education starts with...
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this, you know, these are strategies that go way beyond what law can do. And I think what I want to say about that is I have never thought that law in and of itself can do much of anything. I mean, law is one piece of a larger puzzle of how we go about changing behavior. I think it's important because people listen to what to say, because it's seen as an authoritative way of saying things. But if you're going to rely on law and courts to make social change, you're going to wait a long time. I mean, this has to be done as part of a very holistic strategy that starts with kids, starts with teaching tolerance, starts with having kids learn how other kids live, starts with education in history, and maybe that's where some of this stuff starts with face-to-face meetings with people who are different than you. Right? I mean, there's a whole panoply of things that go beyond anything that I'm talking about. I have my little piece of this. I don't pretend that it's more than a little piece, but I think it is a little piece that's worthwhile. Yeah.
In regard to prevention of war crimes, to what extent is there a mechanism set up that the various armed forces, the various countries in the world are informed of these rules and will really teach it to their officers?
Yes. With regard to established state military forces, there are actually very good procedures for teaching these rules. The U.S. Army, although you might not believe this, where was the comment on my live back there? But the U.S. Army, since the Civil War, has had codes against war crimes. And these are taught to every cadet, and they're taught to every soldier, and the Geneva Conventions are taught in military school. Now, whether anybody in a combat situation stops to remember, oh, wait a minute, that would violate the Geneva Conventions is another question, and I have my doubts.
And to what degree of any emphasis in reality, you can say it's taught. It's like you can say, in med school, it's taught Dr. Kinship for 2 hours. So, I mean, you can say it's taught, but how is it taught? To what emphasis?
I mean, again, going back to the previous question, maybe one place where this is useful is when it's taught, right? Rather than being, this is something that's sort of fluff and don't pay too much attention to it, it becomes, and if you don't do this, you can be hauled up before an international court and you could be sent to jail. Right? And the fact that your commanding officer ordered you to do it is not going to happen, right? Or the fact that you're the commanding officer and that it wasn't directly you, it was somebody under your command, is also not going to help, right? So there may be some use in these public judgments, right, in bringing home to the people who are in the military academy that, wait a minute, this is not just fluff. This is not something that we're sort of throwing on here the same way we throw on doctor-patient relationships in medical school and we got to teach you the real hard stuff, right? That this is real, you need to take it into account. Now, having said that, let me tell you the other problem. The other problem is that more and more the kinds of situations of genocide that we're seeing are not regular armies. And there you have a whole other set of questions. Yeah? This goes back to the question, I think you raised this before, what do you do with the fact that you have militias? What do you do with the fact that you have, somebody coming forward and saying, yeah, well, they weren't under my command because they weren't regular militaries. These were paramilitary, they were militias, they were spontaneously organized mobs, they were, who knows what, right? Then what happens to the laws of war, right? One of the problems is that the laws of war were codified on the basis of World War I, World War II, and other regular conflicts. And less of these situations of genocide are based on the clashing of two regular armies. Right? Most of them have at least one army that is not. And where there are real questions about, who's in command, what's the chain of command. One of the big proof problems that they're going to have in the former Yugoslavia case, as well as in the Rwanda case, is showing that there was a chain of command. And a lot of the investigations are going towards that end, of showing that these people who went in to a village, burned the village down, and murdered people and threw everybody out, even though it turns out they were the neighbors from the next village, or even from the same village, they were sufficiently organized, trained, incited, and under the command of Bosnian Serb regular military, right, or Croat or whoever, that the laws of war applied. And that's going to be a very difficult showing in some cases. Similarly, in Rwanda, if you're going to try and show violations of Article 3, you have to show some kind of organization, right? And if somebody comes back, and as I'm sure some of the defendants are going to do, and says, no, just occurred to me, right? I saw everybody else doing this, and so it occurred to me to go out and do it too. Yeah? Then what? Right? Yeah, then where's your chain of command? It's going to be very, very difficult. Can you establish a chain of command, for instance, through a radio station? In Rwanda, this was one of the big issues, right? Many of the people who participated say the reason they did it was because the radio station told them to. Well, is that a chain of command? For genocide, it doesn't matter, because genocide, you can be a private person, military, civilian, it makes no difference. But if you're trying to show war crimes, it may make a difference. Yeah? So that's the other issue. Yeah.
War crimes, etc., over the centuries, and yet Hitler came along, never again, and now we have all the wonderful things that are happening now. None of which do we have a response to when the next nuclear holocaust will come along. Because we're talking about machetes, you know, how long is that going to last? We're progressing at a tremendous speed into our own doom if we don't do something really meaningful. And I don't see it happening.
Well, what's something mean? Benevolent dictator coming and telling us how to behave?
Well, I think we all
It is
have to
part of the
work on what
process.
something meaningful means in terms of educating people that we're living on one planet.
We're doing that here.
It's not happening outside. We're doing this here because we choose to spend our footwork to come here. But it's not happening out there.
Still part of the
People don't
process.
even read the paper.
I'm frustrated, but it's part of the process, part of our historical moment. What more is there? If somebody came and was a benevolent dictator and with all of these great ideas to say everything stops, that would work, but that's not how we want to do it.
We don't want a dictator of any kind.
But I think that, you know, what we're all struggling with here is that it's everything that we're doing seems so little for the enormity of the problem, and that's what we're all struggling with here. Right?
But giving up is not an option.
Well, that's one thing I was going to say. Giving up is not an option. And the second thing is all steps are incremental. You know, every piece of improvement is little. But if you get enough of them, it makes a difference.
But it's only coming through to a few of us.
Well, there's your job. Go out and
At the
tell other
beginning,
people.
that's
right?
how everything
That's part of what
started.
has to be done.
Been a few of us for a long time.
Yeah, in the back, in the black.
Wondering, since the obvious precedence for the tribunal of the Security Council is the Nuremberg Council Court, how detailed was the thinking in rejecting the capital punishment as an option in the tribunal's sentencing? What was the thinking that went into that?
There is a considerable body of law that says that at this point, the death penalty violates international human rights norms. Now, I know this will come as a surprise to you. The U.S. has always stood itself outside what is more and more an international consensus along those lines. And so when there was discussion of putting a tribunal in place, it was thought that if the death penalty was for the tribunal, that would be inconsistent with this whole line of thinking in international human rights law, which said that the death penalty was not consistent with international human rights, and especially imposing the death penalty for crimes where it did not yet exist was extraordinarily problematic. Even if you had the death penalty and there was no obligation to abolish, to go ahead and institute it for new crimes or for crimes where it was not yet clear that it applied was very problematic. Now, in the Rwandan case, there was, as I mentioned, considerable opposition to this, coming mostly from the Rwandan government, but also from other African governments who said, you know, this is a European business. You know, we have the death penalty in Africa. We like it. We think it's useful. You know, who are you, Denmark and Sweden and the Netherlands, to tell us, you know, that there shouldn't be a death penalty for what we all agree are extraordinarily heinous crimes?
At Nuremberg, was the death penalty just kind of considered the obvious is that just de rigueur for the times?
Yes, I mean, I don't think it was thought about very much at that point. For the tundras, right? There were a number of cases where there were convictions, especially in the sort of the post-Nuremberg trials held by the Allies, where there were convictions to death which were then commuted, which were then not carried out. So there was a fair amount of that went on, of death sentences that were not executed. There were actually relatively few death sentences that actually were executed at Nuremberg, but there was the option to do that. The idea has been that since then there has been an evolution in international human rights law, and that was the problem. Yeah.
Would it be beneficial, or would it create too much chaos and more resistance to expand the definition of war? Since what we knew as war in the last 50 years has greatly changed, so that you look at the militias and whatever. Is that a possibility, or would that just create more chaos and
Well, tell me
politics?
tell me what you think. What good would it do?
If the definition of war were redefined and updated, then when we talk about war crimes and militias and volunteers and what's combat and what is civil and what's international and what's national, perhaps that would help to resolve and clarify a lot of that debate in where justice is lost. Or any
To
kind
some degree, that's happening. And the main place where it's happening, as I mentioned a little bit, is there used to be this very clear distinction between international armed conflicts and non-international armed conflicts. International armed conflicts, there were a whole host of protections, a whole bunch of things you couldn't do. And if you did them, there was an obligation to try you and put you in prison. There was protection for the civilian population. There were a whole series of provisions. For non-international armed conflict, there was one article of the Geneva Conventions that said basically you shouldn't kill people, rape them, torture them, otherwise do nasty things to them, period. Right? Nothing about protection, nothing about prosecution, nothing about having to internally take action against soldiers that do that. Right? And what's happened over the years is that the provisions of the Geneva Conventions about having to take action against your own soldiers that do these things, being able to prosecute somebody else's soldiers that do these things, protection of the civilian population against these sort of things, have been little by little imported into situations of non-international armed conflict, of civil war. So that really more and more the same protections apply. And the statutes actually of the ad hoc go quite a ways in that direction, in that they say, these are international crimes no matter whether the war is international or civil. Now, we could go a whole lot further, right? And I think that's the direction in which the law is starting to go, is to say this is irrelevant. Now, the next problem comes, what about situations that don't even rise to the level of a civil war, right? That are just a repressive government going after an unarmed population, right? Those are not covered under either version of war crimes, right? They're covered if you can bring them within the definition of genocide, but remember that requires an intent to go after a racial, ethnic, religious group, right? So it doesn't get at that situation either. Crimes against humanity, which is the other sort of rubric under which we talk about these things, might cover it. Yeah, and that's kind of the closest, yeah. But we have been a little bit reluctant to talk about these things specifically as crimes against humanity. And one of the things that the tribunals can do is to get us to the point of saying, it doesn't matter if there is an armed conflict, national or international or multinational or whatever, right? If there is a situation where large numbers of people are being hurt, that's good enough. Yeah, and we may get there through the jurisprudence of the tribunal. I think that's the direction.
Well, I'm sorry to have to break off the discussion because it's fascinating and I'd like to ask some questions myself, but we are out of time. And